Close your eyes for a second and try to imagine a place where pain simply doesn't exist. It's not that you've learned to deal with it. It was never even invented. The word disease doesn't exist. There is no hunger, no fear, and none of that feeling of emptiness that appears in your chest when you are alone in the middle of the night. Now try to imagine something even more radical. You don't know what death is. The concept makes no sense. No one has ever explained it to you because it has never happened. No creature, no plant, no cell has ever died since the beginning of everything. Can you process that? Because I confess that the more I research the Garden of Eden, the more I realize that we have no idea what was lost there. And the question that wouldn't leave my head was this: if that place was so perfect, what was it really like to live there? What did Adam and Eve do all day? What was it like to wake up, breathe, and walk in that garden? And the most disturbing part, what exactly did humanity lose when it all ended? To start building this image, we first need to understand something that most people completely ignore. The Bible doesn't say that God created Eden out of nothing. Genesis 2:8 is very specific. The Lord God planted a garden in Eden, in the east. Planted. This Hebrew word, nata, is the same one used to describe someone planting a vineyard with their own hands. It wasn't a snap of the fingers. The text describes God as a gardener who chose a place, prepared the soil, and cultivated every tree there with a purpose. And the place he chose was not random. Eden in Hebrew comes from a root meaning delight or pleasure, but that wasn't the name of the garden. It was the name of the region. The garden was inside Eden. And Genesis gives us the most specific coordinates any ancient text has ever tried to give about a place. 4 rivers began there. We still know the Tigris and the Euphrates today. They cut through Iraq from north to south. The other 2, the Pishon and the Gihon, are a mystery that has tormented geographers, theologians, and archaeologists for millennia. Some researchers, like archaeologist Juris Zarins, spent decades crossing satellite images with the biblical text and proposed that Eden was located in the region where the Persian Gulf is today, an area that 8,000 years ago was a fertile plain before being swallowed by the sea. But regardless of the exact location, what the text describes is disturbingly beautiful. Try to visualize this: a garden where every tree was, in the words of Genesis 2:9, pleasant to the sight and good for food. There were no thorns, there were no weeds, there were no poisonous plants. Every fruit that hung from every branch was simultaneously aesthetically perfect and nutritionally complete. Imagine walking among trees where every fruit you touch is at the exact point of ripeness. Never too green, never rotten. The skin gives way to the touch with just the right pressure. The juice is sweet without being cloying, and every bite satisfies not just hunger, but something deeper, something we might not even have the receptors to feel anymore. And it wasn't a monotonous row of just one species. The Hebrew text uses the expression kol etz, every tree, every imaginable variety. Fruits that perhaps no longer exist, extinct along with that original ecosystem, colors we have never seen, textures we have never touched, aromas we have never smelled. All of this growing in perfect harmony without competition for soil, without pests, without parasites, each plant receiving exactly the amount of water and light it needed. And at the center of it all, 2 trees that were not like the others, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The text places both in the middle of the garden, a central position impossible to ignore. The tree of life is mentioned almost in passing in Genesis, but when it reappears at the end of the Bible, in Revelation 22, the text says it produces 12 kinds of fruit, a different one each month, and that its leaves serve for the healing of the nations. 12 different fruits from a single tree. If that is what it does after all of human history, imagine what it did at the beginning, when everything was perfect. Many theologians, from Irenaeus of Lyons in the 2nd century to modern scholars like John Walton, argue that eating from this tree regularly was what kept Adam and Eve in a state of physical immortality. It wasn't that they were immortal by nature. They were made of organic matter from the dust of the ground, as the text says. But as long as they ate from that tree, the aging process simply didn't activate. Every cell renewed itself perfectly, no mutations, no degradation. The human body functioning exactly as it was designed, without entropy, without wear and tear, without the slow and inevitable march that we accept as normal. Now think about what that means in practice. Adam wakes up. There is no alarm clock because there is no obligation based on a schedule. There isn't that feeling of heaviness in the eyes, that muscular sluggishness of the morning. The body simply awakens, totally restored, without back pain, without joint stiffness, without that mental fog that takes 20 minutes and a cup of coffee to dissipate. In fact, sleep in Eden probably wasn't a necessity for repair like it is for us. The body wasn't wearing itself out during the day, so sleep wasn't a biological obligation for survival. It was pleasure, pure rest. He opens his eyes. The temperature is perfect. Genesis 2:5-6 makes a strange observation that most people skip. The Lord God had not yet caused it to rain on the earth, but a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. No rain, no storms. Without that suffocating heat of 100 degrees or that cold that cuts to the bone, the climate was regulated by a system completely different from what we know. A mist rising from the earth, a natural irrigation system that kept everything moist, cool, and temperate. Some researchers, like physicist and theologian Gerald Schroeder, suggest that this indicates a radically different atmosphere, possibly with a layer of water vapor in the upper atmosphere that functioned as a natural greenhouse, keeping the temperature stable across the entire planet. No extremes, no brutal seasons, a constant climate of spring. And the first thing Adam sees when he looks around? Life. On all sides. Genesis tells us that God brought all the land animals and all the birds before Adam so that he could name them. But for most people, this is a sentence that passes without impact. Think about what that really means. Adam looks into the eyes of a lion, and the lion looks back without any instinct to attack. No muscle tension, no dilated pupils, no deep growl that freezes the blood. Isaiah 11:6-7 gives a clue as to what it was like before the fall, when describing the restored future. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the cow and the bear shall graze together. If that is the destination, it was also the starting point. The animals in Eden were herbivores, all of them. Genesis leaves no room for doubt. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food, every living thing. That lion that today brings down a 2,000-pound buffalo with a bite to the trachea. In Eden, he chewed on plants. Those canine teeth, those retractable claws, they all existed, but the function was completely different. Today's panda, with all its carnivore anatomy, eats almost exclusively bamboo. That is a pale shadow of what was universal in Eden. If you believe that God always knew what he was planning and that every detail of the world was designed with intelligence, comment, God knows everything. Think about the implication of this for Adam's daily life. He didn't need to fear any creature. No snake was venomous. No scorpion had a lethal sting. No mosquito carried malaria. He could stick his hand into any tree hollow, swim in any river, lie down on any lawn without checking if there was something dangerous hidden there. The paranoia we carry in our DNA, that reflex of jumping when something moves in the corner of our eye, did not exist. It didn't need to exist. Nothing in the world wanted to hurt you. And the animals were not only not dangerous, They responded to Adam. When God brought each creature to receive its name, the Hebrew text uses the word yasar for the formation of the animals and wayikra for the act of naming, the same verb used when a king decrees authority. Adam wasn't making a zoological catalogue. He was exercising royal dominion over every species. And the impressive fact is that he succeeded. He didn't need a notebook. He didn't confuse names. He didn't forget a. His brain functioned at full capacity without the cognitive limitations that modern neuroscience says we carry. In fact, let's talk about that because it is one of the most underestimated aspects of life before the fall. Adam's mind. The modern human brain uses, according to researchers like Marcus Rachel of Washington University, about 20% of the body's total energy, despite representing only 2% of body mass. It is the most expensive organ we have. And even so, any neuroscientist will tell you that we operate with absurd limitations, failing memory, fragmented attention, slow processing compared to the volume of information we receive. We forget faces, confuse dates, and cannot maintain focus for more than 20 minutes without effort. Now imagine that same brain without any of those limitations. No neurodegeneration, no chronic inflammation, no cortisol-destroying synapses, no accumulated sleep deprivation, no toxins, no pollution, no stress. A human brain operating at the absolute maximum potential for which it was designed. Adam looked at an animal and instantly understood its essence, its behavior, its nature, its role in the ecosystem, and translated all of that into a name that perfectly captured what that creature was. It wasn't guessing, it was pure perception. And here enters something that completely changes the way we imagine daily life in Eden. Work. Yes, work. Genesis clearly says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. Before sin, before the curse, before by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread," work already existed. But it was a type of work that we can no longer experience. The Hebrew word for cultivate or work here is abad, which can also be translated as to serve, and keep is shamar, to protect, care for, or watch over. Adam wasn't doing exhausting manual labor. He was taking care of something he loved. Think of the difference between carrying bricks in 100-degree sun because you need the paycheck and tending a personal garden on a cool spring morning because every plant there gives you pleasure. That is the distance between work after the fall and work in Eden. The same activity, a completely opposite experience. There were no weeds to pull, there were no pests to fight, there were no droughts, frosts, or floods to fear. The soil responded perfectly. Everything Adam planted grew, everything he watered flourished. The work was creative, not reactive. He wasn't fighting against the environment, he was collaborating with it. Every seed was a promise that was always fulfilled. And this work was not solitary. Because at some point, and the text presents this as an event of enormous theological weight, God looks at all this perfection and says something that breaks the pattern of everything that came before. 6 times during creation, God looks at what he made and declares, "It is good." But in Genesis 2, for the first and only time, he says, "It is not good. It is not good that the man should be alone." In the middle of a perfect garden surrounded by docile animals, with access to the tree of life and the direct presence of God, something was incomplete. And what God does next is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the entire Bible. He causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep. The Hebrew uses tardama, the same word used for the trance that fell over Abraham in Genesis 15, a supernatural sleep, not a common one. And while Adam sleeps, God removes something from him. The traditional translation says rib, but the Hebrew word tsela is used in other parts of the Old Testament to describe the side of a structure, the side of the Ark of the Covenant, the side of the tabernacle. Some scholars, like Hebraist Zioni Zevit, argue that God didn't take a bone. He took an entire part of Adam's side, a substantial portion of his being. And when Adam wakes up and sees Eve for the first time, his reaction is the first recorded poetry in human history. This, at last, is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. In Hebrew, the words have rhythm, they have meter. It is a song. Adam looks at Eve and doesn't analyze, doesn't evaluate. He sings. After naming hundreds or perhaps thousands of animals, none of them filled what was missing. And now before him is someone he instantly recognizes as part of himself. Not inferior, not superior, essential. And here enters a detail that many people ignore about the relationship between Adam and Eve before the fall. Genesis says, "The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." This sentence is much deeper than it seems. It's not just about clothes. It's about total vulnerability without fear. Think about what that means, to be completely exposed before another person, without any defense, without a mask, without a filter, and not feel an ounce of shame. No insecurity, no comparison, without that voice in your head saying, "I wonder what they are thinking of me." There was no manipulation. There was no jealousy. There were no power games. Two human beings looking at each other with absolute transparency and accepting each other completely. If you have ever tried to be totally honest with someone, totally vulnerable, you know how hard it is. You know how we automatically hide, soften, and edit. In Eden, that didn't exist. Communication between Adam and Eve was direct, pure, without noise. What one felt, the other understood. What one meant to say, the other heard exactly. But the most impressive aspect of life in Eden wasn't the garden. It wasn't the animals. It wasn't even the relationship between Adam and Eve. It was something else, something that makes all of that look like background detail. Genesis 3:8 lets slip, almost in passing, information that should stop us in shock, and they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. God walking in the garden in the late afternoon breeze. This was not a one-time event. The Hebrew text uses a verbal form, the hitpail of halak, which indicates habitual, repetitive action. God used to walk through the garden. It was a routine. Every day when the afternoon breeze blew, God appeared. Not as a terrifying cloud on top of a mountain, not as a thundering voice that made the ground shake. He walked, like someone going to meet friends. If you can grasp the weight of this, pause for a second. The creator of the universe, the same being who says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega," appeared every afternoon to talk with two people in a garden, without an intermediary, without a priest, without a temple, without ritual, face to face. And that completely changes what we understand by life in Eden. It wasn't a paradise of eternal vacation where two humans lay under a tree eating fruit. It was a life with purpose, to cultivate, keep, name, exercise dominion, relate to one another, and all of this culminated in a daily encounter with God Himself. The day's work had meaning, because in the afternoon they were going to talk with the one who designed it all. If this touched you in any way, leave a like now. This video took a long time to research, and this simple gesture helps it reach more people who need to hear this. Imagine the conversations. Adam describing what he observed in the animals that day. Eve showing a new combination of plants she cultivated. Questions being answered directly by the source of all knowledge. No second-hand theology, no doubtful interpretation, no academic debate. The truth about any subject was right there, walking by their side, available like a conversation between a father and a son. And this is where we need to confront something uncomfortable. Because everything I have described so far, the body without pain, the mind without limit, work without suffering, love without fear, the direct presence of God, all of this was not a distant dream. It was the standard. This was how human life was designed to be. What we live today, sickness, death, loneliness, distrust, crushing work, the silence of God, that is the anomaly. That is the deviation. Eden was not the exception. Eden was the rule. And perhaps this is the most painful part of truly understanding the Garden of Eden. It's not just a beautiful story about the past. It's an inventory of everything that was lost. Every time you feel a pain that won't go away, every time you try to connect with someone and can't, every time you work to exhaustion and feel it's not enough, you are living the distance between what was meant to be and what it became. But Eden held more secrets than these, because there were things in that garden that even Adam didn't fully understand, things that were there from the beginning, waiting, watching. And the most dangerous of all was not a tree. It was a presence that had already passed through eternity and chosen to fall. Before we get to that part, and I promise we will go deep into it, I need to show you something that almost no one mentions about the physical structure of Eden. Because the garden was not a shapeless open field. The biblical text gives clues of an architecture. Genesis describes a river that flowed out of Eden to water the garden and then divided into 4 branches. A single river that branched into 4. This suggests a specific topography. The garden was at a high point, a kind of plateau or mountain from which water flowed in all directions. And this is not an irrelevant geographical detail. Theologian Gregory Beale, in his book on the theology of the temple, demonstrates that the description of Eden follows exactly the pattern of what would later be the tabernacle and Solomon's temple. A sacred space with zones of progressive access, from the outer to the innermost, from the common to the holy. Eden was the larger region, the garden was the sacred space within it, and at the absolute center, the Holy of Holies, so to speak, stood the 2 trees and the presence of God. Adam and Eve didn't just live in a beautiful garden. They lived in a temple, the first temple, and they were the priests. The same words used in Genesis, abad and shamar, to work and to keep, are the same words used in Numbers 3:7-8, to describe the function of the Levites in the tabernacle, to serve and to keep. This is not a linguistic coincidence. It is design. Adam was not just a gardener, he was God's first priest on earth, and Eden was the first meeting place between heaven and earth. And when you understand this, the forbidden tree takes on a completely new dimension, because it wasn't just a test of obedience, it was a matter of priestly trust. The priest has access to the sacred space. He knows the limits. He knows what he can and cannot touch. When God said, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat," he was establishing the same principle that would later appear in the Holy of Holies of the temple. You can enter. You have access. But there is a limit that cannot be crossed. Not because God wants to deprive you of something, but because crossing that limit changes the nature of who you are. And this is exactly where things get dark, because in the middle of all this perfection, this temple garden, this life without death, this daily encounter with God, there was a creature that had already crossed that limit, that had already chosen to step over the border, and it wasn't on the outside of Eden trying to get in. It was already inside. How does a talking serpent appear in the middle of paradise? Where did it come from? And more importantly, why did God allow it to be there? The answer to that question changes everything you think about Eden, because it reveals that the garden was not just a place of rest, it was a place of choice, and choice always requires the presence of an alternative. The text of Genesis 3 presents the serpent as more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made, but Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 tear back the veil and show who was really behind that creature. Ezekiel says something astounding. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering: sardius, topaz and diamond, beryl, onyx and jasper, sapphire, emerald and carbuncle. This being was not a snake crawling on the ground. It was an entity covered in precious stones that reflected light, a being designed to shine, to be beautiful in a way that caused visual impact. Ezekiel continues, "You were blameless in your ways, from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. Perfect, created perfect. And even so he fell." This being had been in the direct presence of God, not in the garden version walking in the afternoon breeze, but in the throne room at the center of spiritual reality. And yet, he chose to rebel. If the perfection of Eden did not prevent the fall of a cherub, it meant that the perfection of the environment was never a guarantee of obedience. Eden was perfect, but freedom was also real. And it is this tension that defined life in the Garden of Eden in a way no one talks about. It was a paradise, yes, but it was a paradise with a locked door in the middle, and the key was in the hands of Adam and Eve. Every day they spent without eating from that tree was a day of active choice. Every afternoon that God walked with them was an afternoon they could have rejected. The beauty of Eden was not passive. It was sustained by the daily decision to trust. If this changed the way you see Eden, comment, "I had never thought of that." Now let's go back to the physical dimension, because there is so much more to explore about what the sensory experience of existing in that place was like. We talked about the trees, the animals, and the climate, but what about the water? Genesis places the river as the central element of the garden, a river that starts there and irrigates everything before dividing into four. Think about that water. No pollution, no sewage particles, no heavy metals, no microplastics. Water in the purest state that has ever existed on the surface of the earth. Crystal clear to the point that you see every stone on the bottom, every fish passing by. And the sound, that constant murmur of water running over stones, the most calming sound known to neuroscience, right there 24 hours a day as a natural soundtrack. And if Revelation 22 is indeed a mirror of the original Eden, as many theologians argue, then that river didn't just carry water. The text of Revelation describes a river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. Water of life. Something that didn't just hydrate, but sustained existence at a level that goes beyond biochemistry. Imagine drinking from that water. Every sip renewing not just the body, but something deeper. The soul, the spirit, the connection to the source of everything. And there is another element that almost never appears in representations of Eden, but should: sound, not silence. Eden was not silent. It was a symphony. Think, hundreds, maybe thousands of species of birds singing without fear of predators, without that short, nervous song that birds make today, interrupted every second to check if something is coming. In Eden, they sang long, freely, in complex and elaborate patterns. The wind passing through different types of foliage created layers of sonic texture. The water of the river added its continuous bass. And the animals, not snoring, not growling, not screaming in pain or hunger, making the sounds they made simply because they were alive and it was good to be alive. Job 38:7 gives a clue as to what the sound environment of the original creation was like. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. If the celestial beings themselves sang at creation, it is hard to imagine that the earthly environment was silent. Eden was probably the most acoustically rich place that ever existed. Every sound was a note in the composition that God was conducting live, every day, and the light. This is a detail that has always fascinated me. Before the fall, before any atmospheric filter caused by catastrophe or climate change, sunlight entered the garden in a way we have probably never experienced, passing through dense and varied foliage, creating complex patterns of light and shadow that changed throughout the day as the sun moved. Reflecting on the river water, casting dancing reflections on the surrounding surfaces, illuminating the fruits on the trees from the inside out, that translucency we sometimes see when light passes through a grape or a slice of apple, but on a massive scale, in fruits of colors and shapes that no longer exist. And if that being described in Ezekiel, covered in precious stones, really dwelt in Eden in his original form, then at certain hours of the day, when the light hit him, the entire garden was filled with fragmented rainbows. Sardius projecting red, sapphire casting blue, emerald spreading green. A being that walked, and as he walked painted the air around him with refracted colors. Before he was the enemy, he was part of the beauty. And this brings us back to the most disturbing question of all about Eden. If everything was so perfect, the body, the mind, work, love, nature, the presence of God, the literal beauty of the world around them, how did Adam and Eve choose something else? How was it that in the face of all this, a conversation with a serpent was enough to undo everything? The answer, I believe, is hidden in a detail that the text of Genesis reveals with an almost cruel subtlety. When the serpent approaches Eve, the first thing it does is not offer the fruit. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't seduce in the obvious sense. It does something much more dangerous. It asks a question. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? Look at the engineering of that question. It distorts what God said. God never prohibited all the trees, only one. But by phrasing it like that, the serpent plants a seed of doubt about God's generosity. Suddenly, the prohibition of a single tree in the midst of thousands looks like an unfair restriction. Suddenly, God doesn't look like a generous father who gave everything except one thing. He looks like a controller who is hiding something. And there, in that moment, for the first time in human history, someone looked at everything they had, everything, and focused on what they couldn't have. Life in Eden was perfect, but perfection needs to be chosen. And on the day it stopped being chosen, the day we know as the fall, the sound of the trees didn't change, the water didn't stop flowing, the river didn't dry up instantly. But when the afternoon breeze blew and those familiar footsteps echoed through the garden, for the first time, Adam and Eve didn't run to meet him. They hid. And in that gesture, hiding from the one who was always the best part of their day, is contained the entire tragedy of human history. Click on the video appearing on your screen now. If this one touched you, that one will leave you speechless. But wait, we need to go back a step because I showed you the moment of the fall, and you've probably heard this story dozens of times. The serpent deceived, Eve ate, Adam ate too, God expelled them both. The end. Except it's not the end. And the story isn't that simple, because between the moment Eve bit the fruit and the moment God appeared in the afternoon breeze, things happened that the text describes with an economy of words that hides an avalanche of meaning. Genesis 3:7. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Read it again, slowly. The eyes of both were opened. The eyes that already saw everything, color, shape, texture, the face of God, now saw something new, something that didn't exist before. They saw themselves in a way they had never seen before. And the first thing this new look produced was not wisdom, not power, not enlightenment. It was shame. The serpent had promised that they would be like God, knowing good and evil. And technically, it didn't lie. They did come to know evil. But knowing evil doesn't mean understanding evil in an intellectual way, like someone reading an article. It means feeling evil, experiencing its presence inside you. It's the difference between reading about what a burn is and putting your hand in the fire. And the first effect of this knowledge was devastating in its simplicity. They looked at each other and felt they needed to cover themselves. The same body that minutes before was perfect, without disease, without defect, a source of joy and connection, was now a source of shame. Nothing had changed physically. No cell had died yet. No wrinkle had appeared. No bone ached. What changed was perception. And that is perhaps the scariest thing about sin. It doesn't need to destroy what you are. It only needs to change how you see yourself. Adam and Eve sowed fig leaves. Stop. Think about the absurdity of that. Two people who had access to the creator of the universe, who walked with him every afternoon, who could ask anything directly to the source of all wisdom. And their first reaction to the problem they created was to try to solve it themselves. With leaves that were going to dry up in hours, wither and tear. The first human attempt to fix themselves was a temporary patch that solved nothing. And honestly, not much has changed since then. And then came the sound, that sound that every afternoon was the best moment of the day. God's footsteps in the garden, the late afternoon breeze carrying his presence to where they were. But this time, instead of running to meet him as they always did, Genesis 3:8 says, they hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. They hid among the trees, the same trees God planted, the same trees they had named, cultivated, and cared for. Now they served as a barrier between them and the Creator. The garden that was made to be a place of meeting became a hiding place. And here the text does something that should give you chills. God calls. He asks, "Where are you?" The omniscient being who sustains every atom of the universe, who knew exactly where Adam was, who knew exactly what had happened, who knew before creating the world that this moment would come, he asks. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted Adam to say it. He wanted to give him the chance to confess, to be honest, to choose transparency instead of hiding. It was an invitation, the first offer of redemption in history, and Adam wasted it. I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. Fear. For the first time in human existence, someone felt afraid of God. The same God who designed every synapse of Adam's brain to feel pleasure, who sculpted every landscape of the garden to enchant, who appeared every afternoon like someone visiting their children, now caused fear, not because he had changed, but because Adam had. And then comes God's question that cuts like a scalpel. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? Who told you? God doesn't ask what happened. He asks who told you. Because someone spoke. Someone introduced a new narrative. Someone made Adam look at himself with eyes that were not God's. And Adam's response is the most human moment, in the worst sense, of the entire Bible. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate. Look at the engineering of that sentence. Adam doesn't say Eve. He says the woman whom you gave me. He throws the responsibility in two directions at once. At Eve for having given the fruit, and at God for having given Eve. The man who hours before composed poetry upon seeing the woman for the first time, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, now reduces her to the woman whom you gave me. What was celebration became accusation, and Eve does the same. The serpent deceived me and I ate. No one takes ownership. No one says I messed up. The chain of guilt keeps passing. Adam blames Eve and God. Eve blames the serpent, and no one stops to say the simple truth. I chose this. This pattern, this inability to look at one's own mistake without pointing at someone else, was born there, at that exact moment. And you recognize it, don't you? Every couple's argument that turns into a competition of who messed up more. Every family fight where no one apologizes first. Every conflict where everyone has a justification and no one has responsibility. It all started with the woman whom you gave me. And then God pronounces the consequences, and the order in which he speaks is significant. First the serpent, then Eve, then Adam. From the instigator to the last participant, to the serpent. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all days of your life. Whatever the original form of that creature was, and the text suggests it was something very different from what we know, now it would crawl. But the most important part of the curse on the serpent is not zoological, it is prophetic. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. There, in the middle of the greatest tragedy in human history, seconds after the fall, God already announces the solution. The offspring of the woman, someone who would come from her, would crush the serpent's head. The heel would be bruised in the process. There would be pain, there would be a cost, but the head would be crushed. The victory would be definitive. Christian tradition sees here the first prophecy about Jesus. And even if you are not a Christian, even if you read this as literature, the narrative structure is extraordinary. The antidote is announced at the exact moment the poison enters. To Eve, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Think of the weight of that. The ability to generate life, the most extraordinary thing the human body does, would now be accompanied by pain. Not just any pain, a pain that to this day, with all of modern medicine, with anesthesia and hospitals, is still described by many women as the most intense experience they have ever lived. And it was meant to be different. The body that was designed in Eden, the body that knew no disease or degradation, would have generated life in another way. With intensity, perhaps, with effort, perhaps, but not with this kind of suffering. And the second part, your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. The relationship that was a partnership would now have a power dynamic. What was a complement would become competition. What was bone of my bones would become a struggle for control. Millennia of oppression, of imbalance, of distorted relationships between men and women, it all has its roots in this sentence. And to Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. Look at what happened. Work was not cursed. Work already existed before the fall. It was good, it had a purpose. What was cursed was the soil. The earth that previously responded to Adam's touch with abundance would now resist. It would produce thorns. It would require sweat. The gardener priest who cultivated a temple garden with joy would now fight against the ground itself to scrape out food. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return, till you return to the ground. There it is, the sentence that no human being has managed to reverse. Death, the body that was designed to last forever. That body of impossible complexity, with perfect cellular regeneration, without entropy, now had a clock, a deadline, an end date. Dust to dust. The most democratically distributed information in history, everyone dies. And that was not part of the original design. And then comes the moment that is, for me, one of the most moving in the entire Bible. A moment that almost no one highlights. Genesis 3:21. And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. Stop. Absorb that. Adam and Eve had made their own clothes out of leaves. Ridiculous temporary patches that solved nothing. And God, after pronouncing judgment, after explaining the consequences, after announcing the pain that would come, God himself made clothes for them. Tunics of skin. Real clothes, durable, functional. But think about what that means. To make tunics of skin, an animal had to die. In the garden where no creature had ever died, where death did not exist, where every living being was known by Adam by name, an animal was sacrificed. The first blood spilled in history was not spilled by human violence, it was spilled by God, to cover the shame of those who had disobeyed. If you know the rest of the biblical narrative, you know where this goes. This pattern, innocent life given to cover guilt, repeats throughout the history of Israel until it culminates in a specific point. But there, in Eden, it was the first time, and it was God who initiated it. He didn't wait for Adam to find the solution. He provided, and finally, the expulsion. Genesis 3:23-24. Therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Cherubim, angelic beings positioned at the entrance with a sword of fire. Access was blocked. And the detail that most impresses me is that God did not destroy the garden. He did not erase Eden from existence. He placed a guard, which means that Eden continued to exist. There, somewhere, behind a supernatural barrier, the garden remained. The trees continued to bear fruit. The river continued to flow. The tree of life remained standing, but no one could enter. It's like being kicked out of your own house and standing on the sidewalk, knowing that inside everything remains exactly as you left it. The bed made, the table set, the light on. But the door is locked and you lost the key. Not because the house was destroyed, but because you became incompatible with it. And Adam lived. He lived 930 years, according to Genesis 5:5. 930 years. Imagine, almost a millennium carrying the memory of the garden. Waking up every day, looking at the horizon, and knowing that somewhere, perhaps not so far away, that place still existed. Every sunrise reminded him of the light that passed through the trees of Eden. Every river he encountered was a pale shadow of that original river. Every breeze in the late afternoon brought an echo of those footsteps. And they never came again. 930 years of longing for a place he knew that he touched, where he walked with God, and that he lost. Not because someone took it from him by force, but because he chose to listen to another voice. And now I need to show you something that connects everything we talked about in this video. Because the story of Eden doesn't end in Genesis 3. It has an echo, a deliberate reflection in the last book of the Bible. Revelation 21 and 22 describe what theologians call the restoration of all things. And when you place Genesis alongside Revelation, the parallel is breathtaking. In Eden, there was a river. In Revelation 22, there is a river, the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. In Eden, there was the tree of life. In Revelation 22, it reappears through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. In Eden, God walked with humans. In Revelation 21, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. In Eden, there was no death. In Revelation 21, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore. Do you perceive what is happening? The Bible is a book that begins in a garden and ends in a city, but the city has a garden. It begins with a river and ends with a river. It begins with a tree of life and ends with the same tree. It begins with God walking with humans and ends with God living with humans. The entire story, the thousands of years, the wars, the empires, the prophets, the kings, the exile, the cross, it is all the way back to what was lost in Eden, but with a crucial difference. In the new creation of Revelation, there is no serpent, there is no forbidden tree, there is no test, because the choice has already been made. Not by Adam, who failed, but by that offspring of the woman promised back in Genesis. Someone made the choice that Adam didn't make. Someone faced the temptation and did not give in. Someone crushed the serpent's head and had his heel bruised in the process. Eden was the draft. What comes next is the final version. And the final version is better because it includes something the original Eden didn't have. It includes the certainty that it will never be lost again. If you watch this video this far, you are not an ordinary person. Most would have left in the first few minutes, but you stayed. You wanted to go deep. And if what you heard today changed anything in how you see this story, if Eden stopped being a childhood illustration and became something real, something that hurts because it was lost, and something that inspires because it can be restored, then I ask you one thing. Click on the next video appearing now on your screen. It continues exactly from where this one left off, and what comes next is even more impressive. But I want you to stop for a second before you go, because I need to show you why this story is not just an ancient story, why Eden is not just theology, why it matters to you now, today, this week. Think with me. We live in an age where we have more comfort than any generation that has ever existed. Air conditioning, anesthesia, antibiotics, food delivered to the door in 30 minutes, instant access to practically all human knowledge on a device that fits in your pocket. And yet, depression rates have never been higher. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 280 million people in the world suffer from depression. Anxiety is the most common mental illness on the planet. The consumption of antidepressants has tripled in 2 decades in several developed countries. Loneliness has become an epidemic. The US Surgeon General officially declared in 2023 that loneliness is a public health crisis as lethal as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. 15 cigarettes a day from loneliness. And if the story of Eden is right, if the human being was really designed to live in connection without barriers with the Creator, in total harmony with another human being, in full communion with nature, then what we're feeling is not a bug. It is the logical consequence of being disconnected from everything we were made for. We miss Eden, not as a conscious memory, not like someone remembering a place they visited, but like someone feeling an absence they cannot name. That emptiness that appears on Sunday night when everything is silent. That restlessness that no professional achievement really solves. That feeling that there should be more. Not more things, not more money, more something. Something you don't know how to name, but that you would feel immediately if you found it. C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, who was an atheist until age 32 and converted to Christianity against his own will, as he said himself. Lewis wrote a sentence that summarizes this better than anything I could say. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Another world. Or perhaps a garden. And this is where the story of Eden becomes more than a narrative about the past. It becomes a diagnosis of the present. Because look at what the fall produced, and see if you don't recognize each of these symptoms in your own life. Shame. The feeling that if people knew who you really are, they would leave. The need to maintain an edited version of yourself, to sow fig leaves, which today are Instagram filters, inflated resumes, rehearsed answers when someone asks, "How are you?" Fear. Adam heard God's footsteps and hid. How many people today flee from silence, flee from being alone with their own thoughts? The cell phone is the first thing we pick up in the morning and the last thing we put down at night. And perhaps it's not because we love technology. Perhaps it's because we are afraid of what we will hear if we stay in silence. Transferred guilt. The woman whom you gave me. The chronic inability to say I messed up without adding a but. Every fight that escalates because no one wants to be the first to lower their guard. Every relationship that dies, not for lack of love, but for excess of pride. Adam's pattern is alive. It lives in your house. It sits at your dinner table. And perhaps the deepest of all, work that exhausts instead of fulfilling. In pain you shall eat of the ground. Research shows that more than 60% of workers in the world say they are disengaged at work. They don't hate what they do, but they also don't feel purpose. It's just sweat. It's just survival. It's thorns and thistles every day until you retire or give up. And deep down, something inside whispers that it shouldn't be like this. That work should be something else, that there should be joy in doing, in creating, in cultivating, and that voice is right, because one day it was like that. But the story of Eden also contains something that most people ignore completely. It contains hope, and not a vague motivational hope like an office poster, a structural hope, embedded in the narrative. Because remember, in the darkest moment when the sentence was being pronounced, God already spoke of the solution, the offspring of the woman, the serpent's head crushed. Before Adam finished digesting what he had lost, God had already announced how it would be recovered. And after the judgment, after the pain, after the curse, after everything, God made clothes, he himself, with his own hands, if we can speak that way. He killed an animal, took the skin, cut it, sewed it, and clothed the two. The judge clothed the condemned. The offended cared for the offenders. And this pattern, judgment followed by provision, consequence followed by grace, hard truth followed by practical love, is God's pattern from Genesis to Revelation. He never just condemns. He condemns and provides. He expels from the garden and promises the return. He closes the door and already starts building another one. Do you know what the story of the whole Bible is? It is God saying, "Where are you?" And humanity spending thousands of years learning to stop hiding to finally answer, "Here, I am here, and I need you." And that leads me to the final point. What do you do with this story? Because if it is true, if it is not a myth, if it is not a legend, if Eden really existed and really was lost, then two things are true at the same time. The first, the pain you feel is real. It's not whining, it's not weakness, it's not a lack of gratitude. It is the direct result of living in a world that is not what it should be. You were not designed for anxiety. You were not designed for loneliness. You were not designed for fear. These things are invaders. They are thorns in a garden that should have only fruits. And recognizing that is not pessimism, it is honesty. It is looking at the world as it is and having the courage to say, "This is not right." And that courage comes from knowing how it was. And the second, the hope you feel is also real. That stubborn intuition that things can be better, that there should be a place where everything makes sense, where relationships don't break, where work has purpose, where death does not have the last word, that intuition is not naivety, it is memory, genetic memory, spiritual memory, narrative memory, call it what you want. But it is real, because the garden existed, and according to the Bible, something even better than it is being prepared. Eden is not a story about the past. It is a story about what was lost, and about what will be restored. And between those 2 points, between the garden of the beginning and the city garden of the end, are we, walking, working among thorns, feeling a longing for something we have never seen but that we would recognize in an instant if we found it. Hearing, in the quietest afternoons, something that sounds like footsteps, and perhaps, just perhaps, the question still echoes, where are you? If you made it this far, click on the next video appearing on your screen now. I prepared it especially for those who watch this video until the end, and what comes next will completely change the way you see these stories.